Jessica zipped up her dress and then padded in stockinged feet to examine the effect in the bathroom mirror. Not bad, she decided, pivoting to check it out from the back. When Amy had called that afternoon, Jessica had confessed that she had nothing to wear to Leela's ball. 10 minutes later, Amy showed up with a sequined cobalt blue dress that Jessica had always been crazy about.
"Wear it," Amy had commanded. "Keep it. It's a better color on you, anyway."
Jessica twirled again, giving the gown's ruffled taffeta hem a flirty flip. The sequins, the bare spaghetti straps, the look was both sexy and elegant, Jessica's favorite combination. I could stop traffic in this dress, she thought glumly, settling back flat on her feet and pouting at the mirror. But who cares? What's the point? As she stepped back into her bedroom, Jessica thought she heard a voice, a whisper. She froze, listening intently. Had it come from Elizabeth's room? She turned to the window, peering out at the dark, rainy night. Or did it come from outside? Jessica shivered, goosebumps rising on her bare arms. I'm imagining things, she decided. There wasn't any voice. But even as she shook her head, dismissing the possibility of ghosts and spiritual messages, she felt sure of something deep in her heart. I shouldn't go out tonight. I should stay right here. It's safer. Safer than what? She asked herself an instant later. She laughed out loud. What am I going to do? Snuggle down on the couch with Stephen and Billy? They'd really appreciate that. She flounced over to her dresser to look for some jewelry that would complement the blue dress. No, she concluded. There's no way I'm staying in this house tonight. The thought of spending New Year's Eve alone in her room with the memory of all that she'd lost was absolutely unbearable. Jessica considered a pair of rhinestone teardrop earrings and then a chunky gold necklace, but neither seemed quite right for the dress. Then inspiration struck. I know what would be perfect, she thought, pawing through a cluttered drawer stuffed with various fashion accessories. Those little silver bow earrings with the fake sapphires. Her hand touched something she didn't expect to find in the drawer. A small book of some sort. She lifted it out, her eyes widening when she recognized the mini yearbook that had been distributed as a souvenir at the Jungle Prom. I didn't realize I kept one of these, Jessica thought, turning it over in her hands. I didn't want a souvenir. I didn't want to remember that night. She opened the book, reading the first page. The names of people who'd helped put the yearbook together were listed, and at the top of them all was Elizabeth Wakefield. Jessica's hands tightened on the book. That's right. This was Liz's pet project, she remembered. Just one of the zillion things she did to help plan the prom and show her school spirit. With an effort, Jessica thought back to that time before Sam's death. She remembered how she and Elizabeth had come up with the Jungle Prom theme together, and after presenting the idea to the student body, had been named co-chairs of the prom committee. That was when I got lazy, Jessica admitted to herself. She hadn't really wanted to be bothered with any of the nitty-gritty details of organizing a school dance. She'd opted to campaign for prom queen by leading special cheers at pep rallies and distributing Jungle Prom Save the Rainforest buttons. Whereas Elizabeth, flipping through the glossy pages of the mini yearbook, Jessica bit her lip. Liz deserved to be prom queen. If only I hadn't been so greedy and selfish. If I just accepted the fact that she was the best candidate and let her win instead of trying to ruin her chances, Sam would still be alive today. And James would too, because there never would have been a Sam Woodruff Memorial Rally. So we never would have met, and James wouldn't have been waiting for me on the pier that night. None of this would have happened. Jessica knew it was deadly to allow her thoughts to take this course. Guilt and sorrow welled up in her like a rising tide, threatening to suck her down into depths from which she would never return. There's no going back, she reminded herself. I can't live my life over. I can't change what I did in the past. But what I do in the future... Slowly it dawned on her. I'm in charge of that. It's still ahead of me. I can choose how I want to act, what I want to do and say, who I want to be. The future is mine. It was New Year's Eve, the last day of the year, an end, but also a beginning. Jessica looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were shadowed and sad, but also determined. Straightening her shoulders, she made a silent vow to herself. I'm going to do it, and this time I won't chicken out. I'll tell Elizabeth what really happened that night. Maybe if we make peace with the past, we can be part of each other's futures. Quickly, before she had time to lose her nerve, Jessica stepped out into the hall and approached Elizabeth's door. Just as she lifted her hand to knock, however, she heard the sound of another knock on the front door downstairs. Todd's here to get Liz, she realized, her shoulders sagging with disappointment. Another chance missed. Jessica ducked back into her room before Elizabeth could catch her lurking in the hall. Leaving her door open a crack, she watched her sister go down to meet Todd. The night is only just beginning, Jessica consoled herself. I missed an opportunity, but it won't be my last opportunity. I'll just have to find another one at Leela's. Returning to her dresser to put on the earrings, Jessica dared to smile at herself in the mirror. The smile was a little shaky, but it was also hopeful. There wasn't a shade of uncertainty in it. This time she'd really made up her mind once and for all. She would confess to Elizabeth before the clock struck midnight, no matter what she had to do to get Elizabeth alone, and no matter what the outcome. Maybe Liz will understand, Jessica thought. Maybe she'll forgive me. Her smile faltered momentarily. Or maybe she'll hate me for the rest of our lives. She swallowed her dread and turned away from the mirror, marching purposefully to the door. It was a risk she had to take. She had to start the new year on an honest footing with her sister. Margo stood in front of the cracked mirror in her rented room, gazing raptly at her own reflection. She was wearing the strapless fuchsia dress she'd bought that afternoon at Lisette's. Her glossy blonde hair was swept up on one side and secured with a single rhinestone-studded barrette. Her soft golden skin and blue-green eyes were highlighted with just a hint of natural-looking makeup. "I look beautiful," she thought, her lips parting in a self-satisfied smile. "I look pure and good and kind. I look loved, desired, envied. I look exactly like Elizabeth Wakefield." She reached for something bright and glittery that was lying on top of the dresser. Slowly, she fastened the gold lavalier necklace around her slender throat. It was the final touch. The transformation was complete. As she stared at the girl in the mirror, Margot's whole life seemed to flicker before her eyes. She watched the person she used to be, the abandoned baby, helpless and hungry, the small, scared foster child dodging the angry blows and cruel words, the young girl hiding in closets and corners, hoping to evade the unwanted, abusive attentions of her older foster brothers, the teenager finally becoming wise in the ways of the world, learning to fight back, to turn the tables, to repay neglect and abuse with weapons of her own: theft, arson, murder. For a long time, Margo had been trying not to think about where she'd come from, what she'd had to do to reach this place and time. But now she reveled in the gory, glorious memories. "They tried to erase me," she thought, dabbing some pale pink gloss on her lips. "They tried to crush me under their heels like an insect. But instead of curling up and dying, I got bigger and stronger and smarter and braver." She'd taken all the pain the world had dealt her and turned it into raw power. The suffering had been worthwhile. Now she was going to reap what she had sown since she'd come to Sweet Valley. She was going to seize her fate. Turning away from the mirror, Margo took one last look around the room. Some of the furniture was damaged, and the wallpaper was torn in places, but otherwise the room was now clean and empty. She'd thrown away the garbage and all her personal belongings. She destroyed every scrap of evidence of her spying on the Wakefields, all traces of her former identity. She didn't need the notes and photographs anymore. She'd committed the information she'd gathered to memory. She was ready to plunge into the role of a lifetime, she thought, a role for a lifetime. I am Elizabeth Wakefield. Her eyes came to rest on the nightstand next to the bed. 2 items stood on the table: a little beaded evening purse and a clock. Margo looked at the clock as she picked up the purse. "Time to go to the party," she said with a soft, evil smile. Chapter 19.
"This isn't much of a car,"
Ned Wakefield remarked as he steered the old Ford sedan out of the rent-a-wreck parking lot. He accelerated slowly down the main street of Lone Tree Heights, grimacing when the engine backfired.
If it gets us all the way to Sweet Valley, I'll be pretty surprised."
"We were lucky to find it," Mrs. Wakefield reminded him. "The last car in the only rental place in town." Mr. Wakefield braked at a stop sign and then made a left turn onto the coast highway, which they planned to take until they found a place to cut over to the wider, faster inland freeway.
"I still think our best bet would have been to stay put on the train,"
he said. "And sit there going nowhere all night long?" Mrs. Wakefield shook her head emphatically. "This was the right thing to do. The car is—" She tried to think of something positive to say about the battered old vehicle. "It's very, sturdy. It will get us there." "It has to get us there," she added quietly to herself. For half an hour they plowed through the lashing rain and gusting winds in tense silence. Mr. Wakefield's jaw remained tightly clenched. Mrs. Wakefield could tell it was taking all his powers of concentration to stay on the road. They both breathed a sigh of relief when they made it over the coastal mountains to the inland highway, but clearly it was still too soon to feel themselves home free. The weather showed no signs of improving. If anything, as the night wore on, the rain seemed to be getting heavier and the winds wilder. Although the speed limit on the freeway was 55 miles per hour, the sedan crawled along at barely 40. Mr. Wakefield leaned forward in the driver's seat, squinting past the windshield wipers at the deluge.
"I'm not sure how smart this is,"
he pronounced at last.
"I know you're eager to get home, but don't you think we should just pull over somewhere and check into a motel? This drive would be a lot easier and a lot less dangerous by daylight."
Mrs. Wakefield had been nervously folding and unfolding the road map that came with the rental car. Now she stared down at the crumpled paper, searching for their present location. "We're making progress," she insisted. "We'll reach Sweet Valley before midnight." Mr. Wakefield slapped his hand against the steering wheel.
"Does that really matter, Alice? Is it worth risking both our lives just so we can get home in time to put on party hats and toast the new year?"
"That's not it," she said, pressing a tight crease in the map. She couldn't deny to herself, though, that there was something compelling about the midnight hour, tonight of all nights. It was part of her inexplicable mother's intuition. There was trouble at home, and it was essential that she get there before the clock struck 12. "You're a good driver, Ned. You're doing just fine. We have to keep going. I simply won't spend another night apart from the kids." Mr. Wakefield glanced at her, his dark eyes questioning. She looked back at him, her own eyes naked with pleading. "I wish I could explain it," she whispered, "but I can't. I just know we have to keep going. They need us." At last, Mr. Wakefield nodded agreement, his gaze fixed once more on the dark, rain-slick highway.
"Okay, Alice, we'll go for it. I'll get you home by midnight."
Elizabeth descended the staircase and crossed the hall to the front door, her heels clicking. Unbolting the door, she pulled it open, giving Todd a wide smile of welcome to disguise the fact that she was still tremendously upset about her dream. "Great tux," she greeted him as he stepped in quickly to get out of the rain. "You look fantastic." She waited for him to return the compliment, to bend and give her a hello kiss. Instead, he kept his distance, staring at her with a startled, uncertain expression on his face. "Todd?" she said, questioningly.
Jessica?
Todd ventured. Elizabeth's stomach contracted in a painful knot. It must be the dress, she thought. An understandable mistake. Or wishful thinking on Todd's part? "No, it's me," she said with a tight little laugh. "This is Jessica's dress, though. I know it's not my usual style, but I figured it's New Year's Eve. Why not go a little wild?" Todd hesitated a moment longer, looking intently at her. His eyes bored into hers as if he were trying to read her very soul. Elizabeth stood up to the scrutiny, staring back at him with a wondering expression. "Don't you know me?" she wanted to ask. All at once, Todd tossed his dripping umbrella on the floor and reached out for her, wrapping her up in a big bear hug.
It is you, he murmured gratefully, brushing her cheek with his lips.
Elizabeth laughed again. "Of course it is. Who else would it be?" She started to pull back from the embrace, but Todd pulled her close again, holding her even more tightly.
"I'm not going to let you go, Liz," he whispered. "Not tonight. Not ever."
Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes suddenly misty with tears. What had happened between her and Jessica was terrible, but she was still incredibly lucky. She still had Todd. "No," she said softly, "don't ever let me go." For a moment they stood in the front hall, their mouths melting together in a passionate and yet incredibly tender kiss.
"Let's skip Leela's,"
Todd suggested, his voice husky. "Let's just stay here." Elizabeth smiled. "Stephen and Billy already have dibs on the couch in the den," she told him. "Besides, everyone's expecting us. Come on, let's say goodbye." Peeking into the family room, Elizabeth and Todd waved goodbye to Stephen and Billy. Then they stepped outside into the wild and stormy night. "What a night!" Elizabeth cried as the wind seized their umbrella, whipping it inside out. For a split second, she felt tempted to take Todd up on his half-joking suggestion and retreat back into the warm security of the house. There was something frightening about the trees tossing madly in the storm, about the howl of the wind and the relentlessness of the rain. She glanced over her shoulder, imagining she saw a shadowy figure dart behind the shrubbery. Maybe it would be nice to spend a quiet New Year's Eve at home, like Stephen and Billy, she thought. Todd and I could curl up together somewhere, and I could tell him about my dream. He could help me understand it, help me decide what to do about Jessica. Todd wrestled with the umbrella, inverting it back to its proper shape. Then he held it over Elizabeth's head.
"Okay, if we're going to go, let's go."
Elizabeth peered up at him, suddenly wondering about his somber and preoccupied expression. He's worrying about something, too, she suspected. "Is anything on your mind?" she asked. Todd opened his mouth and then snapped it shut again. If he'd been on the verge of confiding something, he'd changed his mind.
Nothing in particular," he said. "I was just thinking about how beautiful you are and how much I love you."
Standing under the precarious shelter of the umbrella, they exchanged another warm, sweet kiss. Then Todd wrapped his arm tightly around Elizabeth's waist, and they walked cautiously down the slippery walk toward his car. "It'll be okay. Everything will be okay," Elizabeth decided, relaxing as Todd pressed her close to his side. He was so tall and strong. She knew she could count on him to protect her against any trouble, real or imaginary. "It's just rain. It's just wind," she told herself. "I'm safe with Todd." Josh crouched in the bushes outside the Wakefield's house, peering at Todd Wilkins and the Wakefield girl through glossy, dripping leaves. He was soaked to the skin by the driving rain, but he didn't feel the cold. His sense of urgency and danger kept him warm. He'd spent a long, terrifying day hiding in the tool shed of a large private residence a few miles from the county jail. As soon as it was dark, he'd made his way through alleys and back streets, hiding in the shadows of trees and cars until he'd reached Margo's boarding house, only to find room number 12 abandoned. He was lightheaded with hunger, not having eaten since his prison breakfast. Still, it wasn't difficult for Josh to decide what to do next. From the Palmers' guest house, he'd hoofed it across town to Calico Drive.
I don't know where Margo is, and I don't know exactly what she plans to do,
Josh thought now, watching as the girl, he guessed it was Elizabeth, slipped on the wet path, and Todd clutched her arm to prevent her from losing her balance.
But I do know her plan hinges on the Wakefield twins. If I follow them, sooner or later, they'll lead me to her.
Josh darted from the shrubbery, taking shelter behind the wide, hairy trunk of a palm tree.
Sooner or later, they'll lead me to her.
His lips curved in a grim, determined smile. And then Margo was bound to give the game away. Assuming he was out of the picture, she'd be cocky, overconfident. The minute she made any kind of move toward one of the twins, he'd be there to intercept her and put a stop to her murderous exploits once and for all. He had to stop her, now more than ever. His own freedom, and very likely Elizabeth Wakefield's life, depended on it. Todd and Elizabeth reached the BMW. After settling Elizabeth in the passenger seat, Todd walked around the front of the car and hopped in on the driver's side. The engine started with a muffled roar. The car rolled backward out of the driveway. As soon as the BMW was pointing away from him, Josh ran forward to the next palm tree. He gave Elizabeth and Todd half a block's head start and then started after them on the sidewalk at a steady jog.
Lucky the roads are so bad,
he thought, sucking in deep lungfuls of wet, cold, bracing air. Todd was setting a cautious pace. Josh should be able to keep the BMW in sight and trail Todd and Elizabeth all the way to their New Year's Eve destination. And to Margo. "Bye, Stephen, Billy," Jessica called, waving from the door. "I promise I'll drive safely."
"Have a good time,"
Stephen replied. Billy looked up from the video she and Stephen were watching. "So long, Jess," she called brightly. "See you later tonight." "Yep, sure," Jessica mumbled as she turned to cross the hall to the kitchen. "I probably won't be late." Boy, This is a real riot, she thought grumpily as she coasted the Jeep out of the garage and down the driveway. Driving by myself to New Year's Eve ball on a rainy night in a borrowed dress. Talk about pathetic. Reaching for the dial, she turned the radio on full blast. There was no one to talk to. She might as well belt out a few tunes. Yes, she exclaimed as her favorite new Jamie Peters single came on. She tapped out the beat on the steering wheel, singing along. If I catch you talking to her, yeah, talking to her. If I catch you walking with her, yeah, walking with her. The music stopped abruptly. The rain must be messing things up, Jessica guessed. Just as she was about to fiddle with the dial, a male voice boomed loudly from the car speakers.
Once again, we interrupt this broadcast to report that suspected killer Josh Smith has escaped from Sweet Valley County Jail.
With a gasp of shock, Jessica slammed on the brakes. She pulled the Jeep over to the side of the deserted road and sat for a moment, gripping the wheel tightly. He escaped, she thought, her blood turning icy with terror. Oh my God, he's loose! Instantly, this rainy night seemed to transform itself into another rainy night. Jessica was back on the pier, a scream splitting her body in two as she watched James tumble to his death on the rocks below. She grew dizzy again, remembering how Josh Smith had shouted madly, denying that he'd killed James and blaming it on some imaginary girl who supposedly looked just like Jessica and Elizabeth. He saw us. He'd remember us, Jessica thought, glancing fearfully into the black, stormy night. Suddenly, she realized what a target she offered, hanging out there on the side of the road. A girl alone in a car, a total sitting duck. The Jeep lurched forward as she stepped hard on the gas. Jessica sped toward Leela's neighborhood. A cat darting across the road, the shadows of storm-tossed trees. An old man in a raincoat walking a tiny poodle. Everything made her heart pound with fear. He's out there somewhere, Jessica thought, her teeth chattering. He saw us. We caught him and turned him in. What if he wants revenge? What if he comes after us? Suddenly, the needle of fear probed deeper into Jessica's heart, and an overpowering premonition grabbed hold of her emotions. Josh Smith was on the prowl, and that meant danger for someone. She felt absolutely sure of it. Danger for... A familiar, well-loved face flashed before Jessica's eyes. For... Elizabeth? With an effort, Jessica forced herself to focus on the road before her. All at once, she realized she was approaching the curve where Elizabeth and Sam had crashed the night of the jungle prom. Jessica began to shiver uncontrollably. It was all she could do to keep her hands firm on the steering wheel. Sam, James, death, danger. The events of the past few months were so awful they almost didn't seem real. And is it over yet? Jessica wondered. James's killer had escaped from jail. Josh Smith was at large, perhaps stalking his next victim at this very moment. Supposedly, bad luck comes in threes, Jessica reflected, her palms starting to sweat. First Sam died, and then James. She caught a glimpse of her own pale, terrified face in the rearview mirror. Who would be next? Chapter 20. Leela snapped her fingers as she strolled through the crowd in the living room of Fowler Crest. What a party, she thought, mentally patting herself on the back. No doubt about it, it was the most fun, most elegant, coolest, hippest party she'd ever thrown. Bet we make the social page of tomorrow's LA Times, she gloated as the 10-piece band swung into another jazzy dance tune. Isn't this a blast? She shouted to Bruce and Pamela over the sound of the music. Great dress, Pamela. Pamela looked terrific in a strapless plum velvet sheath that seemed molded to her slender figure. Bruce, meanwhile, could have stepped out of the plate glass window of a Rodeo Drive formal wear boutique. His double-breasted tuxedo hung from his athletic frame as if it had been custom-made. Which it probably was, Leela speculated. She had to hand it to him. Bruce really knew how to dress. I'm just wild about your dress, Leela, Pamela raved. It's breathtaking. Leela gave the skirt of her flouncy black chiffon dress a little flip. Just a little something from Paris, she said lightly. Glad you approve. Bruce slung an arm around Leela's shoulders and planted a loud smack on her cheek.
You're a babe, Fowler, he drawled. Definitely the hostess with the mostess, the belle of the ball, the standard by which all other fair females must be judged. Keep talking, Mr. Smooth, Leela winked at Pamela. I love it. Seriously, though, said Bruce, this is a fabulous party. I couldn't have done better myself. Leela laughed. High praise. Well, have fun, you guys. I'm going to circulate. Slipping back into the crowd, Leela made a beeline for Amy and Barry, who were standing by the buffet table on the other side of the room. Her mood lifted higher and higher as she observed what a great time all her guests were having. Fowler Crest was jam-packed with people dancing, eating, talking, and laughing, their formal dresses and suits mingling in a sparkling rainbow of color. All of a sudden, the flowers, party hats, balloons, and streamers Leela hadn't been able to get very excited about when she and Amy decorated the place seemed just right. I thought no one would be in the mood for a party, but I was wrong, she mused. Maybe this was just what the whole town needed, to let go and have fun again. Maybe her New Year's Eve ball would literally bounce them all right into a great new year. She'd nearly reached Amy and Barry when her eye was caught by one of the couples on the dance floor. Todd Wilkins was cutting a rug with. Leela narrowed her eyes. She'd assumed the girl in his arms would be Elizabeth, but suddenly she was unsure. She recognized the fuchsia dress, and it was definitely not part of Elizabeth's wardrobe. In fact, Leela had been with Jessica when she bought the dress at Lisette's. What's Todd doing dancing with Jessica when he's supposed to be back together with Elizabeth? Leela wondered. What's Jessica doing?
Changing course, Leela headed over to investigate.
I hope Jess isn't flipping out like she did after Sam died and making another pass at Todd,
Leela worried.
Things are such a mess between her and Liz as it is. But why would Todd encourage Jess to...
At the edge of the dance floor, Leela stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes glued to the face of the girl who was dancing with Todd.
Wait a minute. That's not Jessica,
she realized. The soft, gentle smile, the hairstyle, the way she moved. It might be Jessica's dress, but Elizabeth was wearing it. Leela blinked at the couple for a moment longer. She still couldn't quite believe her eyes, because her eyes insisted on seeing double. It was the strangest sensation, like an optical illusion. I've known Jess and Liz forever. Since when do I have trouble telling them apart? Leela wondered, shaking her head as she turned away. I love this kind of music, Elizabeth said to Todd as the band swung into another jazzy dance tune. It makes me feel like a character in The Great Gatsby or something. Todd twirled her around and then pulled her body up against his.
I like it too.
Instead of releasing her for another twirl, he continued to hold her close. Elizabeth laughed, her cheeks turning pink. Todd, this isn't a slow song.
I don't care.
His eyes burned into hers.
I'm not letting you go, remember?
Smiling, Elizabeth clasped her arms around his waist and rested her head on his chest. As they swayed gently to the music, holding one another tightly, Todd's eyes kept moving. He spotted Leela talking with Barry and Amy. Winston and Maria were dancing, as were Ken and Terry, Dee Dee and Bill, and Penny and Neil. Andrea Slade, Nicholas Morrow, Jean West, Scott Trost, Annie and Tony, April and Michael, Sandy and Manuel. Todd checked out the scene in every direction, his gaze passing over the familiar faces, searching for a stranger among them. His vigilance was probably uncalled for. What were the odds that Josh Smith would show up at Fowler Crest?
He'd be crazy too. He'd just get caught,
Todd thought. Then he remembered. Josh Smith was crazy. There was no predicting what a nutcase like that would do.
Maybe the police recaptured him already. With all the troopers they have out looking, he could be back behind bars by now.
It was a comforting thought. Still, Todd's gaze continued to rove, and his arms remained tightly wrapped around Elizabeth. Everyone was cutting loose and enjoying a round yet about the prison break, or else people had heard but weren't worrying about it. Todd couldn't relax, though. He didn't intend to let down his guard for a single second, and he didn't intend to let Elizabeth out of his sight. As long as that homicidal maniac was running around, he planned to stick to Elizabeth like the Secret Service stuck to the president. Two more cars pulled into the long driveway of Fowler Crest. The headlights flicked off and the engines died. A couple stepped out of each car. Josh watched as the young people greeted each other, the girls admiring one another's dresses and the boys joking about their tuxes, yanking on their bow ties and making faces as if they were choking. Finally, they went inside and the coast was clear. Josh darted from a cluster of palm trees and crossed an open stretch of lawn. Reaching the side of the house, he plunged into the shelter of a large rhododendron bush. For a moment, he crouched on his hands and knees, struggling to catch his breath. Cold and hunger were beginning to take their toll. He was winded and shivering. Curiosity revived him, however. Slowly he rose to his feet in order to peer through the tall picture window at the scene within.
It's like a movie,
Josh thought, leaning closer to the glass to hear the muffled sounds of revelry. The elegant mansion was packed with people in festive attire. The bandleader, wearing a white dinner jacket and black bow tie, snapped his fingers and tapped his foot, while a man with a shiny saxophone played a solo. While some kids danced, others stood in small groups, chatting happily and eating. Josh's mouth watered at the sight of a long table draped with a snow-white cloth and laden with platters of food. He hugged himself, shivering in his thin, rain-soaked clothes.
If I could only get a bite of something,
he thought wistfully.
I need the fuel. I need the strength.
Just then he spotted a familiar figure, the tall, dark-haired boy who'd tackled him on the pier, the one whose car he'd followed tonight, Todd Wilkins. The boy was dancing with a pretty blonde girl in a deep pink dress, his girlfriend, Elizabeth Wakefield. Josh's heart began to pound, hot blood pumping fast through his veins as he realized how close he was to the final confrontation. Elizabeth,
or was it Margo?
Josh lifted his hands as if to touch the window, as if to touch the girl.
I'm watching you, Margo,
he said silently.
I'm watching your every move.
Just then he heard the sound of high heels on the flagstone walk behind him, and he dived down into the bushes for cover. Her heels tapping, Jessica walked briskly along the walk toward Leila's front door, one arm bent over her head to protect her hair from the drizzle, since she'd forgotten to bring an umbrella. Suddenly, right next to her, she heard something rustle in the rhododendrons. Jessica jumped, clapping a hand to her mouth to prevent the escape of a startled squeak. It's just a squirrel or a bird, silly, she told herself. Even so, she picked up her pace, glancing apprehensively over her shoulder as she hurried on. She was still shaken from the news report about the escaped killer. She could think of only one thing. One thing only impelled her forward. Elizabeth, I have to make sure she's okay. The heavy front door of Fowler Crest swung open as Jessica approached. She stepped into the party, her expression a little wild, her eyes searching frantically. Spotting Elizabeth's bright fuchsia dress, almost immediately, Jessica's knees buckled with relief. There she is, by the buffet table, talking to Enid, Jessica thought, inhaling deeply to stop her heart from racing. She's all right. She's fine. Of course that psycho didn't get her. Geez, what was I freaking out about? She stepped forward into the crush of bodies. Hi, Jeannie, she called, waving. Hey, Robin, I love your dress. The tension melted from Jessica's body as she became part of the lively crowd. It was a horrible, ominous, rainy night. but they were all safe and warm and dry inside Leela's big house. The danger, if there is any, is out there, Jessica decided. No harm can come to us in here. The song they'd been dancing to ended, and Elizabeth and Todd drew apart reluctantly. "Thanks," Elizabeth said softly. "That was fun."
"Let's not stop,"
Todd urged, reaching for her again.
"Let's dance all night."
"I wouldn't mind sitting down for a few minutes," Elizabeth told him, smiling. "I'm wearing heels, not track shoes. In fact, what if we—" She considered drawing Todd aside to talk to him about her latest jungle prom dream. As she looked for a place to sit down, she spotted Enid standing near the buffet table on the other side of the room. "Enid's here. I'm just going to pop over and say hello," Elizabeth told Todd. "Be right back, okay?"
"Wait, Liz, I'll come with—"
But Elizabeth was already weaving her way through the swirl of dancers, leaving Todd behind. "Hi, how are you?" asked Elizabeth as she stepped up to Enid's side and put out a hand to touch the sleeve of her friend's dark green velvet dress. "Enid, this is beautiful. It matches the color of your eyes exactly."
"Hi again yourself," Enid replied with a bemused smile. "And thanks again for the compliment."
Elizabeth tipped her head to one side, puzzled. "Again? What do you mean?" At that moment, she caught sight of someone over Enid's shoulder. Jessica had just arrived at the party and was greeting her friends. As if sensing Elizabeth's gaze, Jessica raised her eyes and looked right at her sister. Their eyes locked for a split second, and Elizabeth saw a hesitant smile flicker across Jessica's face. To Elizabeth's dismay, Jessica turned and started heading in her direction. Elizabeth's heart began to race. A sea of tumultuous emotions welled up inside her. "I can't act civil and normal toward Jessica," she thought, desperately looking around for a place to hide. "I can't pretend I'm still ignorant about what she did to me the night of the prom." At the same time, Elizabeth knew she wasn't ready to confront Jessica with what she'd learned from her dream. Not yet, and certainly not at Leela's New Year's Eve ball with zillions of people around. Out of the corner of her eye, Elizabeth could see Jessica getting closer. "I can't deal with her. I've got to get out of here. Racking her brain for an excuse to beat a hasty retreat, she came up with a classic. "I'm going upstairs to the bathroom," she announced abruptly, shoving past Enid. "See you later." Startled, Enid stepped out of the way. "Sure," she said, looking baffled as Elizabeth sprinted off toward the staircase. Jessica stopped in her tracks. Elizabeth had whirled around and was now elbowing her way through the party guests, heading for the hall. "Is she leaving?" Jessica wondered. She watched as Elizabeth hurried up the main staircase that led to the second and third floors of Fowler Crest, taking the steps 2 at a time. "She's just going to the powder room," Jessica concluded, "but she sure ran off in a hurry." She bit her lip. Was it because she saw me? It was starting to look as if making this confession would be harder than she thought. If Elizabeth couldn't stand even to be in the same crowded room with her... "I can't wimp out, though. I made a resolution," Jessica reminded herself. It was going to be tough, but it would only get more difficult the longer she put it off. She lingered a moment longer, figuring she'd give Elizabeth a chance to start back downstairs before she waylaid her. Just then, Leela strolled up and gave her a quick hug. "Hey, Jess, I'm so glad you came." "Me too," Jessica fibbed. "This is probably the fanciest, best New Year's Eve party in the history of Sweet Valley."
"That was my goal anyway,"
said Leela. She patted Jessica's arm sympathetically.
"I see you lent Liz your newest dress, and you got stuck wearing one of Amy's hand-me-downs."
"It's not so shabby," Jessica protested. "Amy's only worn it once or twice."
"I didn't say it was shabby," Leela assured her. "But I personally think it's more fun on a night like this to wear something you bought just for the occasion. Don't worry, you look gorgeous."
She patted Jessica's arm again.
"But it is too bad you didn't settle on any of the dresses you tried on when we went shopping the other day."
"Hmm?" Jessica murmured, her eyes wandering back to the staircase. "What are you talking about?"
"That purple dress was really cute," Leela explained. "And you might notice that nobody's wearing purple tonight, which means you would have stood out in the crowd. But I also liked the black one with a—"
Leela continued to blab on about some shopping trip that Jessica was pretty sure must have taken place in Leela's mind, since the two of them hadn't gone to the mall together in ages. Jessica, meanwhile, tuned out her friend's chatter. Eyes on the staircase, she mulled over various strategies for stealing a moment alone with Elizabeth. "I have to get this crushing weight off my shoulders," she thought. "I have to confess to Elizabeth before the clock strikes midnight." For a second, Todd lost sight of Elizabeth in the sea of revelers. Then he glimpsed her talking to Enid and started after her. By the time he reached Enid, however, Elizabeth was gone.
"She went upstairs," Enid told him. "She'll be back in a minute or two."
Enid seemed about to say something else, but Todd didn't feel like making small talk. Continuing out into the entryway, he gazed up the wide, curving staircase. The second-floor hallway was shadowy and deserted.
"I'll just wait outside the powder room,"
he decided, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Elizabeth was going to think he was crazy, but he just didn't want to chance it. He'd vowed to keep her in sight every minute. It was the only way to make absolutely certain no harm came to her. Todd was fairly familiar with Leela's house from previous parties, so he knew that there were 2 bathrooms on the second-floor hallway, one near the stairs and the other 6 or 7 doors down. The door to the first was ajar and the light was out. No Elizabeth there. And to his surprise and consternation, the other powder room was also vacant.
"Where can she have gone?"
Todd wondered, an irrational feeling of panic sweeping over him. Striding to the far end of the hall, he started opening doors one after the other. Guest bedrooms, master suite, sitting rooms, all dark and apparently empty. Opening another door, Todd peered into the shadows, his eyes making a quick search. Again, nothing. He slammed the door and hurried on to the next.
"I'm going nuts," he thought, breathing fast. "She can't have just disappeared into thin air. She must be here somewhere."
Grasping the knob, he yanked open another door, prepared for disappointment. But instead of being dark, the guest bedroom he burst into was bathed in the warm glow of a small lamp. And standing in front of the dressing table, fluffing her hair in the mirror, was Elizabeth.
"Here you are!"
Todd exclaimed with relief. Hurrying up behind Elizabeth, he wrapped his arms around her waist.
"What are you doing, hiding like this?"
Elizabeth met his eyes in the mirror. "I'm not hiding, just freshening up a little." She smiled, her dimple flashing. "I was hoping you'd come looking for me." Bending his head, Todd nuzzled the back of Elizabeth's neck.
"I told you I wouldn't let you out of my sight tonight, or out of my arms."
Elizabeth leaned back against him, closing her eyes and sighing deeply. "Well, that's just fine with me." As Todd kissed her neck again, his lips touched cool gold.
"I didn't notice before that you were wearing your necklace," he said. "You found it."
"That's right." Turning to face him, Elizabeth ran her hands up his arms, massaging his shoulders with her fingers. "I found everything that rightfully belongs to me." She slid her hands to his neck, pulling him toward her for a kiss. Eagerly, Todd brought his mouth down to hers. Their lips brushed in a tantalizing fashion. And then Todd stiffened, his arms still locked around Elizabeth. Her eyes were half closed, her lips parted in a tiny smile of anticipation. What was it about that smile? It was lovely and inviting, but also eerie, almost sinister. It was the smile of a stranger.
"Something isn't right," Todd thought. "Someone isn't right."
With a jolt of recognition, he realized this was the same unnerving feeling he'd experienced a few days before Christmas, when he went to the movies with Elizabeth. Or rather, with Jessica pretending for some mysterious reason to be Elizabeth. Paralyzed with uncertainty, Todd stared into the face of the girl he held in his arms. Was this Jessica again, trying to dupe him?
"No, it can't be," he thought. "Jessica's wearing blue. I just saw her downstairs. This is Liz, in the pink dress. Of course it's Liz."
Dismissing his doubts, he bent his head to kiss her. Again, as their lips met, he froze. A wave of repulsion shook his body. Every nerve seemed to cry out, "No!"
"This is crazy," Todd thought. "What's with you, Wilkins?"
Crazy or not, though, he couldn't control his feelings. And all he wanted at that moment was to get out of the room, to get away from Elizabeth.
"Let's go back downstairs to the party,"
he suggested lightly.
"We're missing all the fun."
"Forget the party, Todd," Elizabeth murmured, smiling slyly. Todd had taken a step backward, trying to hold her at arm's length, but she pulled him close again. "We can have our own party right here. Doesn't that sound like more fun?" The words and the tone hit Todd like a bucket of ice-cold water. Instantly, he knew he wasn't with Elizabeth. Elizabeth would never say something like that, unless her body had been taken over by aliens. And even Jessica
wouldn't go this far,
Todd realized, his eyes widening.
"So that means—"
Todd stared at the blue-green eyes, the smooth golden skin, the girl's hair, her lips, her throat, her shoulders.
"All the features are right, but—"
He remembered Josh Smith at the police station ranting and raving that someone else pushed James. Margo, a girl who looked just like the twins.
He wasn't lying.
Todd realized, the blood draining from his face and his knees buckling. There was someone else on the pier that dark, rainy night. Someone else did murder James. Someone who looked so much like Elizabeth that she could impersonate her, that she could even fool Elizabeth's own boyfriend. The girl was watching Todd closely, her expression suddenly wary. Todd grasped her arms, his eyes boring into hers.
They're the right color, he observed, but everything else about them is wrong.
The girl's eyes were somehow empty, soulless. They held no emotion, no warmth, no humanity. They were like the eyes of a china doll, or of a mad person, of a killer. There was no longer any room for doubt.
You're not Elizabeth,
Todd sputtered, horror nearly robbing him of the power of speech.
And if you're not Jessica either, who?
The beautiful mouth he'd come so close to kissing twisted into a hideous grimace. The girl writhed in his arms like a snake, struggling to escape. Todd's fingers tightened, digging into the bare flesh of her arms.
Who are you?
He cried, shaking her hard. Snarling like a wildcat, the girl wrenched from his grasp, astonishing Todd with her strength. Reaching behind her, she fumbled on the dressing table, grabbing something. Before Todd could raise a hand to shield himself, she swung her arm, aiming straight for his skull. Chapter 21. Margo stood panting, Todd's unconscious body sprawled at her feet, and a brass statuette still clutched in her hand. The idiot, she muttered, wiping the sweat from her upper lip. The big, stupid idiot. Didn't he know a good thing when he saw it? Didn't he realize he'd have a lot more fun with her than he ever had with Elizabeth? Margo stared down at Todd, watching his chest rise and fall. He was out like a light, but he wasn't dead, far from it. Her fingers itched, and she reached for the statuette again. I'll hit him once more, she thought, and this time I'll crush his skull. Kill him. I have to kill him. He knows about me. She stroked the smooth, cold brass, considering. Now that the heat of the moment was passing, she could look at the matter objectively. No, she decided at last. It's not really necessary. Killing Todd would ruin the purity and simplicity of her plan. There would be only one perfect death that night, Elizabeth's. But he'll wake up and tell people what happened in here. He'll tell them I'm not Elizabeth. Margo chewed her lip, her brow furrowed. Then her face cleared, and she smiled. Yes, he'd tell them that. But so what? Why on earth would anyone believe him? It was such a wild, improbable, impossible story. They'd think he was nuts, a raving lunatic. Yes, poor Todd went insane. That's what I'll tell people, and it won't be too tough for them to see it for themselves. As Margo stepped carefully around Todd's prostrate body, she heaved a sigh of regret. He really was incredibly handsome. But Elizabeth, I won't have any trouble finding a new boyfriend, she thought, smiling with anticipation at the prospect of auditioning prospective new suitors. One who's not quite so stuffy. Margo licked her lips. She really couldn't wait. Not tonight, though, she reminded herself as she slipped from the room, switching off the light and locking the door behind her so no one would stumble upon Todd while he was sleeping it off. There was no time for flirting tonight. She still had very important work to do. There were still 3 Wakefield girls wandering around where there should only be 2. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the tub in Leela's bathroom, her chin in her hands. She wondered if Jessica had followed her upstairs, if Jessica was checking the powder rooms, if it would occur to her that Elizabeth might be hiding in the bathroom in Leela's bedroom. Not that I'm hiding, exactly, Elizabeth rationalized. I just needed some peace and quiet, a place where I could hear myself think. The bathroom was certainly quiet. Not a single sound penetrated from the party below. But Elizabeth's state of mind remained far from tranquil. Though her body was motionless, she still felt as if she were strapped into some kind of terrifying amusement park ride, spinning out of control. Getting to her feet, she stood in front of the mirror. Gosh, I look like I just saw a ghost. I've really got to pull myself together. She fumbled in her purse for some lip gloss and spent a minute touching up her makeup. Then she brushed her hair with measured strokes, trying to inhale and exhale in a slow, even rhythm. Watching herself in the mirror, she saw her expression begin to grow calmer. Gradually, she started to look more like herself, like someone capable of handling anything that came her way, even this crisis with Jessica. Jessica, Elizabeth thought, staring deep into her own eyes. As she thought about her sister, a strange thing happened. Just for a moment, the face in the mirror seemed to change ever so slightly. Just for a moment, Elizabeth found herself looking at Jessica's face in the mirror rather than at her own reflection. Jessica's eyes were almost unbelievably sad, tortured by grief and remorse. Her trembling lips were on the verge of spilling forth words of apology. For the first time since the Jeep accident, Elizabeth felt as if she were seeing her sister clearly. And all at once she recognized just how awful this had been for Jessica, too. In her imagination, Elizabeth traveled back in time and stood squarely in Jessica's shoes on that fateful night and all the days that followed. The pain of it was heart-wrenching. What an agonizing burden for Jessica to bear, knowing that Sam had died in part because of her own thoughtless prank. Spiking the punch was a mean, stupid thing to do, but I went overboard with the whole prom queen rivalry, too, Elizabeth reflected. And when she did it, she couldn't have known where it would lead. She couldn't have anticipated how the night would end. She was just being typical, thoughtless Jessica. A knock on the bathroom door jolted Elizabeth from her reverie. Just a moment, Leela, she called. I'll be right out. Liz, it's me, Jessica, a voice said softly. I really need to talk to you in private. Elizabeth felt cornered. There was only one reason Jessica could want to talk to her so badly. Only one thing she could need so desperately to get off her chest. Sooner or later, they had to confront the monstrous obstacle that stood between them. But right now, I'm not ready for this conversation, Elizabeth thought. Please, Jess, just go away. But Jessica was still there, on the other side of the door. Please, Liz, she pressed. It's really important. I'll wait for you out at the pool house, okay? Elizabeth took a deep breath. We might as well get this over with. Let's just talk here, she said. Her suggestion was met by silence. Jessica? Elizabeth opened the door. Leela's bedroom was dark and empty. Crossing to the outer door, Elizabeth peered into the hallway. There was no one there. We're so close, Mrs. Wakefield moaned, pulling her raincoat more tightly around her. I can't believe this happened, just a stone's throw from home.
I've almost got it fixed,
Mr. Wakefield grunted.
A few more bolts.
Standing in the rain by the side of the highway, Mrs. Wakefield watched her husband wrestle the flat tire off the rental car. Fortunately, there had been a jack and a spare tire in the trunk, but even with the necessary tools, it was going to take half an hour to deal with the flat. It's unbelievable, simply unbelievable, she reflected. Everything that could go wrong on the trip had gone wrong. She was starting to think they would never make it home. Mrs. Wakefield glanced at her watch. 15 minutes until midnight, and only a few miles from Sweet Valley. I'd probably get there quicker if I walked. She bit her lip, gazing down the hillside at the distant, twinkling lights of Sweet Valley. She'd been so eager to get home tonight, before the arrival of the new year. The feeling was so urgent, so compelling. Why? Mrs. Wakefield asked herself for the 100th time. How could it matter? She didn't know. She only knew that, for some inexplicable reason, it did matter, and now it looked as if they wouldn't be able to pull it off. Mr. Wakefield was working as fast as he could. Obviously, he had no desire to spend any longer than he had to changing a flat tire in the pouring rain. But time stopped for no one. The minutes continued to race by. Mrs. Wakefield continued to stare toward Sweet Valley, wishing that she could see in the twinkling lights of the distant town some sign that her children were safe and well. But the lights seemed cold rather than reassuring. They didn't tell her anything. Mrs. Wakefield shut her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. I know she came up here, Jessica thought, hurrying down the second-floor hallway of Fowler Crest. So where is she? Jessica checked each room on the floor, one by one, searching for Elizabeth. The door to the powder room nearest the staircase was locked, but when it opened after a few minutes, its occupant turned out to be Sally Larson, not Elizabeth. The guest bedrooms and sitting rooms, Leela's parents' suite, the far powder room, all turned out to be dark and empty. Jessica pushed open the door to Leela's room. Immediately, she saw a sliver of light. The bathroom door was ajar. Someone was in there. Of course, anyone who knows about this bathroom would come in here instead of using the ones in the hall, Jessica reasoned. It's a lot more private. Liz, she called. Is that you? There was no answer. Her feet soundless in the thick carpet, Jessica crossed the room and gave the bathroom door a gentle push. It swung inward, revealing nothing. Jessica stepped into the bathroom, a frown creasing her forehead. For a moment, she'd felt so sure she'd found Elizabeth. She almost sensed her sister's presence in the room. I'm getting vibes, all right, Jessica thought. The question is, are they good vibes or bad vibes? She turned to leave. As her gaze strayed along the countertop, it was arrested by a tiny pot of lip gloss standing somewhat separate from the clutter of other beauty products. Jessica picked up the lip gloss, examining it. It was a pale rose shade, almost translucent, a color she knew Elizabeth liked. And Leela never wears this stuff, she thought. She likes lipstick. The redder, the better. If Elizabeth had been in the bathroom, though, where had she disappeared to? Returning to the hallway, Jessica checked the last few guest rooms. 2 were empty and 1 was locked. Jessica crouched to see if any light was coming under the door of the locked room, but it looked as dark as all the others. She rapped lightly on the door and was answered with complete and utter silence. It's empty, too, she concluded. They're all empty. Standing alone in the deserted hallway, Jessica fought down an irrational feeling of panic. To anyone else, the atmosphere on the second floor would have seemed peaceful and quiet. But to Jessica, it was charged with mystery and danger. Vibrations seemed to pulse through the air. A dreadful certainty seized her heart, choking off the pulse of blood. Liz is in trouble. Frantically, Jessica made her way back down the hall, double-checking all the rooms. A clock in a small sitting room caught her eye. 11:50. Just 10 minutes until midnight. Jessica remembered her vow to bare her soul to Elizabeth before the new year. More than ever, she longed to be with her sister at that moment. Not just for her own sake now, but for Elizabeth's too. I have to find her, Jessica determined. I have to protect her. From what? Or from whom? Was she just upset about the news that Josh Smith had escaped from jail? Was she overreacting? Jessica didn't know the source of her fear. She only knew that some mysterious impulse urged her on like a whip, stinging at her heels. She had to keep on looking. Let's put the movie on pause, Billy suggested, sitting up on the couch so she could reach the remote control. She hit the stop button for the VCR and the movie disappeared, a local TV news program taking its place. I mean, who are we kidding? We're not watching it. Stephen lowered her back against the pile of throw pillows. Speak for yourself, he teased as he pressed kisses all the way up her throat to her chin. I haven't taken my eyes off the screen for a second. Billy wrapped her arms around his waist, and their lips met in another leisurely, delicious kiss.
Stephen murmured. I guess you're right. Who needs movies? Real-life love scenes are a lot more fun.
We've got to be careful not to steam up the windows too much, though, Billy said with a throaty laugh.
What'll your sisters think?
Stephen really didn't care. He couldn't focus on anything except how good it felt being there with Billy.
I wish we could stay right here forever,
he told her, brushing a strand of hair back from her forehead.
I don't think I'd ever get tired of kissing you.
She smiled, playing with the buttons on his polo shirt.
You'd better not, buddy.
Their mouths melted together in another kiss as hot as a forest fire. Stephen closed his eyes, giving himself up to the magic. When Billy suddenly pushed him away, he blinked at her in surprise.
What's the matter?
Shh, Billy hissed, pointing at the TV. Listen to this. Stephen sat up in time to see the solemn face of a newscaster give way to a black and white photo of a man. My God, Stephen breathed when he realized what the story was about.
That's the guy who killed James. Don't tell me he escaped from jail.
Billy confirmed, her eyes wide as saucers. This morning, it sounds like, and they still haven't caught him. The reporter gave an update on the search for the escaped murderer, and then the program switched to a weather report. Stephen continued to stare at the screen, his mouth suddenly dry as dust.
He's on the loose,
he whispered. The vague, worried feeling that had haunted him all night despite the distraction of Billy's company now blossomed into full flower.
He's loose, and he knows my sisters and Todd, because they were the ones who caught him. What if he goes after them?
He wouldn't, said Billy, but without much conviction.
He'd want to hightail it out of here, don't you think?
It wouldn't make sense to stick around Sweet Valley when there are a million cops looking for him.
This guy doesn't have sense,
Stephen reminded her.
He's a psycho, a lunatic.
He reached for the phone, placing the receiver against his ear, his other hand poised to dial.
I'm going to get Leela's number and call Fowler Crest, he told Billy. I'll feel 100% better if I can just touch base with Liz and Jess.
Even as he punched out the numbers for directory assistance, though, Stephen realized something was wrong. Instead of the dial tone, he heard silence. He tried hanging up and then picking up the phone again. He jiggled the buttons, listening hopefully.
Nothing, he finally announced. The line's dead.
Dead?
Dead,
Stephen repeated. I didn't realize the weather was that bad, Billy commented, wrinkling her forehead. Maybe we should... Stephen, where are you going? Stephen had jumped up off the couch. Sticking his feet into his loafers, he hurried to the hall closet to grab a jacket. Billy ran after him. Where are you going? She asked again.
Fowler Crest, Stephen replied. I'll be back in a flash. I just have to make sure.
Stephen didn't know exactly what he was afraid of.
I just have to make sure they're safe.
Outside, lightning flickered, and a crack of thunder splintered the night. Billy gripped Stephen's arm just as he was about to bolt from the house.
Wait for me, she begged. It's too creepy. I don't want to stay alone here. I'm coming with you.
Jessica rarely had reason to venture to the third floor of Fowler Crest. She didn't know what lay behind half of the closed doors on the shadowy hallway. Elizabeth can't be up here, she thought as she eased open a door and fumbled on the wall for a light switch. Then again, she has to be somewhere, and she definitely wasn't at the party. After searching the second floor, Jessica had gone back downstairs, where she discovered that not only Elizabeth, but Todd also seemed to be missing. She found the switch and flicked it on, holding her breath. The room, an unfinished studio of some sort, was dusty and empty. Running down the hall, Jessica tried the next room and the next. A bedroom, a bathroom, a huge walk-in storage closet. All were vacant, looking as if no one had entered them in ages. At the end of the hall, Jessica stopped and stood panting as if she just finished an especially energetic cheerleading routine. She's disappeared into thin air. What if he got her? Jessica pictured Josh Smith on the pier, only this time his murderous hands were grasping for Elizabeth. I've got to sound the alarm, Jessica decided. I'll tell everybody Liz and Todd are missing and what? She imagined her friends' response. They'd just laugh and elbow each other. Liz and Todd left the party early, huh? Wink, wink. They'll just tell me I'm worrying about nothing, Jessica said out loud to herself. Am I worrying about nothing? She tried to step outside of the situation for a moment to see it objectively. Yes, it was possible nothing was amiss. Elizabeth ran upstairs, Todd went after her, and for whatever reason, the two of them decided not to hang around for the big New Year's Eve countdown. No big deal. The scenario made sense, but it didn't put Jessica's mind at ease. Her heart continued to pound like a drum solo. A cold sweat beaded her forehead. She had a hunch so strong it was almost like a telegraph message. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. It's my twin's intuition, Jessica recognized. For months, Liz and I have barely been on speaking terms, but we're still connected. I've always known, I'll always know when she needs me, and she needs me now. The question remained, though, where was she? Jessica pressed her forehead against the diamond-shaped window at the end of the hall that looked down over the back lawn and swimming pool. Where should I look next? She wondered. Who should I go to for help? Just then, a lightning bolt sliced through the distant sky, briefly illuminating the scene below. Jessica glimpsed a flash of pale hair near the dark pool house, the glimmer of a deep pink dress. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the ghostly figure disappeared from sight. But Jessica had seen enough. Someone's out there, she thought, turning to sprint toward the staircase. Elizabeth! Josh crept around the side of Fowler Crest, keeping close to the house and the shelter provided by the shoulder-high shrubbery.
This isn't going to work,
he realized, raising his head to peek into a living room window. The glass panes were beginning to fog up, and even if he had been able to get a clear view, the party was so crowded now that it would be impossible to keep tabs on Todd Wilkins and the Wakefield twins simply by running from window to window.
I can't go inside, though.
In his ill-fitting, sopping wet prison guard's uniform, and with his pale, gaunt face and desperate eyes, Josh knew he looked exactly like what he was, an escaped convict.
They must be looking all over for me. The kids would just call the police, and I'd be back behind bars in no time.
He couldn't risk it. Then again, he couldn't risk not going inside either. For all he knew, at this very moment, Margo herself was a guest at the party, impersonating one of the twins and preparing to commit another evil crime. It could happen tonight in Fowler Crest while he stood outside in the rain, powerless to intervene.
I'll look for a back door,
Josh decided, crawling through the bushes.
I'll hide in a closet or something. I've got to find her. I've got to stop her.
Reaching the corner of the enormous house, he stood up for a moment, stretching his body to get out the kinks. Raindrops ran down his face and into his eyes, causing him to blink. But what was that? Even with his vision blurred, he was able to see the figure of a girl floating across the grass on the far side of the lawn.
The pink dress,
Josh realized, squinting.
And the blonde hair.
It was the girl he'd seen through the window earlier, dancing with Todd Wilkins. Elizabeth Wakefield.
Or could it be Margo?
The girl disappeared into a small building, a pool house, Josh guessed. Before he could make a move to follow her, however, another figure appeared, hurrying through the rain. Another slim girl with fair hair and a deep pink dress. Josh blinked, wondering if the rain in his eyes or his own fatigue and desperation were causing him to see double.
No, he thought. I saw what I saw.
2 identical girls in identical dresses. One of them had to be Margo. But which one? Who was who? Josh hesitated for a moment, puzzling over the odd sight. Then he realized it didn't matter which girl was Margo and which was Elizabeth. The 2 girls had left the party, heading for a dark, deserted outbuilding. The perfect setting for foul play. One of them had to be Margo, and she was about to act, which meant it was time for him to take action as well. Josh dashed forward, slipping and sliding on the wet grass. He had to reach the pool house before. Elizabeth hurried the last few yards to the pool house, shivering in the cold drizzle. What a strange place for Jessica to pick, she thought, glancing back over her shoulder at the bright lights of Fowler Crest. In that whole huge house, hadn't there been one spot she could have chosen that wouldn't have involved tramping across the muddy lawn in the rain? The door to the pool house was ajar, but no light was on inside. Elizabeth hesitated, wondering if she'd made a mistake. Why would she wait in the dark? Maybe I heard her wrong. She stepped forward, giving the door a tentative push. "Jessica?" she called, her voice small and uncertain. "Are you in here?" Elizabeth thought she heard something. A footstep, a whispered word. She entered the pool house just as a girl stepped out of the shadows. Elizabeth caught her breath for an instant, thinking that she was looking into a mirror. The girl took another step. She was real, not a reflected image. But the dress, Elizabeth thought, surprised. The dress wasn't cobalt blue like Jessica's. It was fuchsia, strapless. The same dress Elizabeth herself was wearing. Someone else at the party bought the same dress. That's all, Elizabeth thought, raising her eyes to the girl's face in the hope that she'd find herself looking at a stranger. But no, the face was her own. Every feature was identical, and around the girl's throat a gold necklace glimmered. My lavalier, Elizabeth thought with surprise. She stood staring at the girl, her eyes wide with shock. She'd been expecting Jessica, but this wasn't Jessica. Something was terribly wrong. The blood drained from Elizabeth's face, leaving her pale as a ghost. You're not Jessica, she whispered. No. The girl's lips curved in a smile, and a tiny dimple creased her cheek. But the smile didn't reach her blue-green eyes. They remained as cold and hard as stones. No, she repeated softly. I'm not Jessica. I'm Elizabeth.